Okay, so you should be seeing, let's see, okay. It wanted me to acknowledge that we were being recorded. All right. So thanks everyone for having me today. Carrie, if you can go do a thumbs up so I can just see that you can see my first slide. Excellent. Okay, I'll tell you all a funny story. I gave a presentation the other day on Zoom and no one could see anything I was saying and no one told me. So I've learned to check. All right, so I'm going to talk today about restoring and preserving tree canopy as a tool for stormwater management. And as I said, I'm very happy to be here today. So I run the Green Infrastructure Center, which is a nonprofit, and we help communities evaluate their green assets and manage them to maximize ecology, economy, and their culture. And we do this by building landscape models, teaching courses and workshops, conducting research, and then we also work on the ground with communities, helping them build strategies. I've written a number of guides and books, and I'm not going to go into all of them today, but just to let you know that if you're interested in this type of work, we have a non-technical guide, Strategic Green Infrastructure Planning, that's really designed for planners and environmental folks. And then we also have, if you are a GIS expert, if you like to do mapping, we have a guide for how to create a green infrastructure strategy using GIS. So today I'm going to give you a project overview. I'm going to talk about trees as green stormwater infrastructure. I'm going to look at the data that we found for Orange County. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the codes and how we analyze your policies, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. So this project is called Trees to Offset Stormwater. And of course, trees provide many other benefits as well. And the project started, I'm actually going to back up before I talk about the grant. The project actually started first in my mind after Hurricane Katrina wreaked so much havoc on the Gulf Coast. And as I spoke to communities along the Gulf, a number of them said they were suffering from additional standing water and flooding. And I asked them how they were solving this problem. And they said, well, we're hiring an engineering firm because that's what we do. When we have standing water problems, we hire engineers. So I talked to the engineers and I said, how are you solving this problem? And they said, well, we're just building more stormwater ponds. At that point, I said, well, do you think that maybe some of this additional standing water is because you lost about half of your tree canopy? And they said, well, yes, that could be a cause of the problem. And I said, well, are we going to plant more trees? And they said, nope, we're going to dig more stormwater ponds because that's what we do. And so I thought there needs to be a way to help cities understand how much water their trees are actually soaking up and start to value those trees as part of their stormwater management strategy. And so I contacted a number of states in the South, and these states agreed to participate. So Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. And in Florida, the communities that we studied were Jacksonville, Orange County, and Miami Beach. And we intentionally wanted to work in different types of communities. So a county, a big city, and then a small coastal community. We wanted to have a diversity of examples so that other Florida communities could say, oh, okay, I can relate to that community. It's similar in size or condition. We all wrote a grant together to the U.S. Forest Service to fund the project. So the project goals were to really help Orange County map, evaluate, protect, and restore its urban and rural forests for improved stormwater management and clean water, because forests are a vital tool in managing and reducing runoff. And I'm going to show you why. So the project outcomes, first we created a map of the land cover, looking at all the different surfaces of Orange County at a 1 meter scale. In some of the more rural parts of the county where, say it was a forested area and it didn't change that much, we mapped it at a 30 meter scale. And what we wanted to do was link the forests to stormwater, calculate how much stormwater the trees were actually soaking up, then recommend codes and policies that the county could consider, and then finally to share the work. So I will not go into every detail of the project today. If you're interested, the Trees to Offset Stormwater case booklet for Orange County is available on our website. And of course, it's absolutely free. So you can go to our website, click on Trees to Offset Stormwater, and you'll get a copy of that case booklet. So we consider natural elements of the landscape to be green infrastructure. And I just created this simple slide to show you what I mean. So on the left-hand side is gray infrastructure, and that's what planners are often concerned with when we look at roads and buildings and stormwater pipes and power lines and all of those things that make civil society possible. But we often don't remember to also look at the green infrastructure, and that's the right side of your slide, and that's showing you, the many lakes in Orange County, the forests, the wetlands, the meadows, all of that sort of natural infrastructure that's also playing a role in keeping Orange County cool, comfortable, beautiful, cleaning the air, taking up volatile organic compounds, reducing urban heating, and many, many other benefits. So what we try to do is ensure that cities and counties consider this green infrastructure in all of their planning. And actually, I love to give this credit. I love to speak to Florida because Florida actually coined the term green infrastructure. If Florida hadn't invented that, I wouldn't be able to run the Green Infrastructure Center. Because honestly, this is where the whole idea started. It started in 1994 in a report to the governor by the Florida Greenways Commission. And they wanted the governor to understand that nature is part of Florida's infrastructure. So Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades, the River of Grass, the wonderful forests in the Panhandle, the beautiful beaches and dunes, all of that nature, if you will, was also part of Florida's infrastructure. And that notion took hold, and the university created a model, the nation's first model, mapping all of those large intact habitats and ranking their importance. And that was then this sort of the framework for the Florida Ecological Network. So a really interesting model that then was copied by Maryland, by Virginia. We copied it and did models for multiple states, and then finally did a national map. So when I say copied, we copied the idea. We copied the notion, and then we built models. But Florida really was the leader in trying to help communities understand about nature as infrastructure. And what it's really about is about connectivity. So it's not just about mapping where those large chunks of intact landscape occur, but how they connect across the landscape. Because the more connected the landscape is, the more resilient it is. Species are allowed to move across the landscape and ensure that we have strong biodiversity. And in urban areas, we still, of course, have lots of green infrastructure. And so this is an example of, I sort of did an idealized example in this cartoon I did, where in each case, the developer protected a large chunk of forest. But as you can see, none of that landscape is really connected. It's all chopped up by roads, et cetera. And this is what happens when we don't look at that large landscape scale first. But we can keep the land connected and drainages intact if we plan at a larger scale. And so now if we had a map or a model to show us where these landscapes were located, we can then put this information into our other master plans, comprehensive plans. So maybe this parcel on the left was not developed. Maybe it becomes a park or a conservation easement. Then in the middle, we do a moderate level of development, and then perhaps put our more intense develop on the far right. So we have the same amount of development. We've just arranged it in a way that allows us to have healthy ecology and healthy communities too. And here's an example of a cluster development. I'm sure you all have heard of those, and hopefully as Orange continues to grow and develop, you guys will consider these types of patterns. So I just took an actual map, and then this is not in Orange County. I don't like to tell where these cartoons are from because then people get all excited. But I do use real data when I make these cartoons. So here we have a road, and then here's like a remaining farm that hasn't been developed with a wetland in place. And this is, I've kind of given this a generous development pattern. I've said, okay, the developer comes in and they decide they want to make a little commons in the middle. That's kind of a trend. And then we just develop all the rest of it. So now we've used up most of the landscape, but you could still have that same amount of development. You could actually just have smaller lots, and then you could create walking trails. You could still enjoy that wetland. It could still function. And all of these parcels are actually now more valuable because they abut a park instead of simply just developing everything. Trees also create healthy communities. And by the way, most of my photos in this slideshow, if not all of them, are from Orange County. So, of course, they provide opportunities to exercise and work. They help us reduce obesity and even that phenomenon of nature deficit disorder. People actually get out of sorts when they can't see or access green spaces. So if anyone's feeling like they've been inside looking at too much Zoom meetings, just be aware that even just looking at a picture of nature improves your mood and your mental capacity. So I'll try to give you a lot of nature pictures. And then clean air. Of course, trees absorb pollutants, like especially particulate matter. And keeping our lungs healthy is super important now in this time of COVID. So having well-treated communities actually helps to reduce pollutants that harm our lungs and keep us healthy. And then, of course, we can cool the county by having more trees. And then well-being and mental health. So I've talked about that a little bit already, but it also turns out that in hospitals, people heal up to 30% faster if they can see or access green. So a number of hospitals have started changing their rooms so there's views of nature, adding healthy grounds around the hospital. And then less crime also occurs near trees. I work a lot with police forces, and they often are concerned about adding trees will cause more criminals to hide behind them. But it turns out that if you look at the data, the better treated the area is, the lower the crime rate. And then employees will exercise if they can access green where they work or on the way to work. And then, of course, urban tree canopy values. So trees provide more attractive areas for development. And you guys probably recognize this picture. It's near you in Winter Park. A study by the University of Washington found people shop longer and spend about 12% more money in tree-lined shopping districts. So as we spend the money to keep our trees healthy and to put them in our streets, we'll get that money back through improved sales, real estate values, meals taxes, and the like. So trees give you more tax revenue, even in developed commercial districts. And then job development. Small companies are looking for places that are greener to locate, and multiple communities across the South have actually outcompeted other areas by offering more green amenities. And then the creative class, artists, media, lawyers, and analysts make up 30% of the US workforce, and they're looking for places where they can get outside and access nature. And especially with COVID, we've actually seen quite a resurgence in smaller communities. People are moving to those smaller communities because they can get outside more safely. So trees and parks attract a better paid jobs, and thus a better tax base. So trees really are the original and best green infrastructure because they give us clean air, shade, beauty, and stormwater benefits far cheaper than engineered systems. A typical tree, like a large, say, oak tree, could take up anywhere from 4,000 gallons of water per tree per year. And then a smaller tree, like a crab apple or a crepe myrtle, might take up more like 760 gallons. So we want to plant as many large canopy shade trees as we can, and then fill in other areas with smaller trees. Because there's a lot of consequences when we don't have enough trees. Now, of course, I have shown a kind of extreme flooding picture there. That kind of flooding would not be all solved by simply adding tree canopy. But it is true that when you pave the landscape excessively, we have more runoff. So I have here on the right my Captain Obvious graph, which is basically just showing you that in a forested landscape, most of the water is infiltrated versus a parking lot where most is not, and most you have runoff. Or another way to look at this is a simple hydrograph I've put here on the bottom. As stream flow increases and time in a paved watershed, all that water is running off very quickly. It's not absorbing. It's hitting those streams. It's hitting the intercoastal at a much greater volume. And so you have higher peak flows, more extreme flows, where in a well-vegetated watershed, it's soaking in more slowly and then releasing to the drainage areas more slowly. So you don't have that sort of extreme flow events. So as land cover changes, of course, so does stormwater infiltration. And so the more we pave, the more runs off, the less water reaches our groundwater table. And we can even have that phenomenon of subsidence as we excessively remove groundwater and also don't allow it to recharge. Our groundwater tables can actually shrink, and we find that subsidence, which for areas challenged by sea level rise is sort of a double whammy there, both having rising seas and subsidence at the same time. So our question is how do we make a developed county like Orange function like a forest? So there are still a lot of forests in Orange County, which is great, but there are also a lot of forests that are threatened with development right now. So our question is kind of how do we take this developed landscape and have it function like a forest? And how can we work to protect the forest that we still have? So in an urban situation, about 20% or more of the annual rainfall is actually retained in the crown of trees. So as water's falling, it's hitting leaves, it's being intercepted. Some of that water is then going down the trunk through stem flow, right? And then also reaching the roots, which also absorb water. Some of that water is being evaporated back into the atmosphere. And of course, some is running off. But a well-forested landscape can delay runoff up to 3.7 hours. And also these roots increase the infiltration capacity of the soils. So even though Florida has a lot of sandy soils, there are still also places that are hard packed because of development or have higher clay content. And tree roots can help us break up that landscape. So tree canopy effectiveness is actually highest during short, low intensity storms. So when it first starts to rain, the trees, the leaves are actually capturing a lot of that water and funneling it down, as I just discussed. But as if we have a large rainstorm, we have multiple inches of water at some point, as you guys know, the tree is saturated, the trunk is saturated, the soils are saturated, and we have runoff. So the sort of smaller scale storms where trees can be most effective. But regardless of the storm size, they'll still do their job to capture a lot of that runoff. So how we determine how well trees can soak up water in Orange County, the first step was to actually classify the land cover. So using aerial imagery and looking at the light waves that are reflected back, we can actually classify what type of vegetation we're looking at, what type of land surface. So we have, trees, we have houses, we have roads, we have water, and we also use LiDAR, so light imaging software that shoots a beam at the earth, and then we measure how long that return interval is. How long does it take the beam to come back? So the return interval is longer if it's going all the way to the ground, like a bush or grass, and shorter if it's hitting the top of a tree. And as you all know, Florida has a lot of shrubs, a lot of really big shrubs. So I have to say that it's very challenging to map Florida, but we managed to do it. We've done multiple cities in Florida now. So how well canopied is Orange County overall? When we look at the entire county, we come up with a pretty good number of about 50.7%. But keep in mind that's looking at the entire county. So if you were to take this data and clip it to the college, you might find a much lower canopy cover. So the idea is we can look at the whole county, but then you can also use GIS to clip out any of these areas and look at them in depth. And for all of you on the phone, since I'm speaking to a college, to let you know that you're welcome to have any of this GIS data that we created. You can clip it away and analyze it to your heart's content. So now we know the land cover, and we can start to consider how much it varies by location. So we just took, you could clip it any way you want. Orlando's actually doing really well at 35%, but Winter Park's doing much better at 42%, Windmere's at 53%. So it definitely varies depending on where you are. And there are reasons for that. Some places obviously are much more urban, but there are many places to add more canopy back. And as we have the storms, and I know storms are on all of our minds because there's been so many this year, as we have more storms and lose trees, we need to be really vigilant about continually planting new ones so that we don't end up in a situation where our canopy has declined substantially. So as we look at where we can plant trees, we take the open spaces that show up in our mapping efforts. So this sort of orange color, I just picked a random area, is area that's open space that potentially could be planted. And the next thing we do is drop a point to represent that potential planting area. And then GIS, we grow out that point to a full canopy tree. We start with large canopy trees, so say 40 to 60 diameter. And then we fit as many of those as we can. And then we go down in scale and say, can we fit some smaller diameter trees, like 20 feet across? So we're not suggesting that all of Orange County should be shaded and there should be no more sun hitting the street. But what we are saying is that we can find many, many places for trees to be added. And so now we can use this data to understand how many trees could be planted. So this is showing you the area by watershed. So we broke it up by watersheds, like I said. And so you can see the green is the existing trees, and then the orange is how much more canopy could be added. And from this glance, you can see that some areas actually have a lot more room for tree planting. The other thing we want to keep in mind is that the larger the tree, the more benefits it's providing, whether it's stormwater uptake, cleaning particulate matter out of the air, shading. We all need more shade in Florida because it's getting hotter and hotter across the southern US. And I'm often asked to talk about palm trees, so I went ahead and put this slide in. So I don't want to get into a big debate about palm trees. I'll just say that palm trees are actually not trees. They may have a tree-like form, but they're actually a grass, technically. So, and if you're really interested, I have a whole write-up on palm trees that I can send anyone who wants to discuss palms. But the key thing to know, palms are part of our culture in Florida, and so they're important. But just keep in mind, if we're trying to think about ecosystem services or environmental values, palms cost about, say, $30 a year in maintenance, but only provide $4 of benefits. And part of that is because their canopy is quite small. They also have the highest nutritional requirements of any plant grown in the state of Florida. So if you're trying to fertilize your palms and take care of them, it's quite expensive. So again, not against palms, but we usually find that we have enough, and we're focusing on trying to plant more large canopy trees, again, to provide the other benefits that we talked about. So when we look at stormwater uptake by trees, it gets a little complicated because we have trees in so many different settings. So here's a natural forest in Orange County, right? So it's got all kinds of shrubs and duff layer, and it's acting like a sponge. It's very dense, typical Florida forest. But then we look at trees in other settings, right? And they might be overhanging a street. So some of the rain droplets that fall don't hit the grass, they hit the street and run off. And then others maybe are sitting in a lawn situation. So the lawn, that grass under there is not as absorptive as a natural forest would be. And then, but at least most of the raindrops that are falling are probably going to be hitting that grass. So that's why we look at the forest by 1 meter by 1 meter, so we can analyze where each raindrop is falling. Is it falling on the street? Is it falling on the lawn? Or is it falling into a mature forest situation? And so when engineers try to figure out how much water might be running off, let's say I want to develop a big parcel in Orange County, the first thing I'm going to need to do after I decide I want to buy it and that it's great for my Florida subdivision, I need to calculate how much runoff my development might generate. And so this is the typical runoff equation that is used. But it's actually been modified for this purpose. So Justin Heinecke, who's one of our staff, he actually took this runoff equation and said, I'm going to change this, and I'm going to add in a canopy interception value. So the way the runoff equation works now, it's primarily based on the types of soil, land cover or soils that are present. And it imagines that as the water is falling, it's not intercepted by anything. It's just going to the ground. And so what this does, this change to this equation, acknowledges the fact that as rain is falling, it might be actually intercepted by a tree. So we're adding in a value to account for the role that trees play in water management. All right, so we've got this nice modified equation, but that's as far as they took it in 1996. So we took it all the way to actually taking this information and then modeling it on the landscape. And different land covers have different types of what's called curve numbers. And so for the non-engineers on the call, which is probably most of us, just to let you know that this, if you look at this in terms of runoff on the left and then rainfall along the bottom. So a curve number of 100 means that every drop of water that's falling is running off, right? So that means that would be like 100% impervious. On down to the lower curve number of 40. So what that means is rain falling in a forested condition, about 40% will still run off, but 60% of the water will be retained or evaporated. Okay, so this is what engineers use when they're making proposals, and that is why we went with this approach to model the trees in Orange County because we want to create a tool that could be used by the environmental folks in the county to do their watershed planning. So the curve number is a coefficient used to estimate runoff. They've been developed for a variety of land covers and soil conditions. There's been a lot of debate about how correct our curve numbers, but no one's come up with a better system, and this is what everyone's using. So we wanted to create something that a wide variety of people could understand. And like I said, most engineers, public works staff understand and apply that approach. All right, and then trees in different conditions have different curve numbers. And the model that we built allows the user to change those curve numbers if they disagree. So for example, in one of the cities that we worked in, actually in Wilmington, North Carolina, they had some sandier soils than we were giving them credit for. And so they changed some of those curve numbers to reflect local conditions. So we worked with Orange County to make sure that they agreed that these curve numbers make sense. All right. And then we can look at land cover by watershed for all of the different types of land cover for each one. And this data then goes into our model. So we know what's being absorbed and what's running off. And by the way, this is the most engineering part of my presentation. I will be getting into codes and policy soon. But we created a calculator tool that models the benefits of maintaining or increasing urban canopy for each watershed. So it tells you the current tree canopy overall. And then you can pick an event. So you can change the rainfall event here. So 10-year storm is usually what most engineers design their facilities for. But you could even go up to a big event. You could even do a 100-year storm, or you could do a small rainfall event, such as a 2-year storm. This is how they size their stormwater drainage facilities. And then you can look at urban tree canopy loss. So you can, if you think you're going to have some losses, you can type that in. You can also account for forested open space loss. So, for example, one of the issues that came up was whether some of the lands that are just east of you guys, going towards the eastern part of the county would be developed in the future. And so this is the kind of tool you can use to look at what would be the change in runoff for some of those lands to be developed. And you can then look at the current impervious cover, how much water is currently being captured by that storm event. So again, change the storm event, you'll get a different number up here. And then you can look at how much tree canopy you have. You can even play around with having a new tree canopy goal. So, and then added capture with adding more planting area. It's kind of hard to show a spreadsheet online. So, but basically all the salmon colored cells you can change. So you can pick your event, then you can look at the results. And then you can also play around with planting goals. So in the far right of your screen, you'll see enter percent to be planted. So it shows you if you planted, say 5%, 10%, however, whatever percent of land you want to plant of your plantable area. All this data in the table is tied to that original GIS data. So it knows how much trees you can plant, and it knows what those percentages are and what the results will be. And so then you could see how much more water you could capture if you planted more trees. All right, you can also model runoff from the loss of trees, right? So here's the loss. So I just made up some pretend loss numbers here. And then I can look at what the new tree canopy would be if I lost some of the trees. And then I can look at the increased runoff that would occur from that tree loss. And I can look at it by the totals. So the totals are all up here, and this is by watershed. But just to let you know, you also could clip it, to your college boundaries. I haven't looked at the boundary of the college property, but you could play around with how much canopy or how much stormwater is Valencia College soaking up. You can also model land pollution, uptake, or runoff for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, because those are 3 pollutants of concern. And so you can look at the change in pollution loading, right? So that's in the same spreadsheet. So when you're changing the other variables, you'll see these change. Or you can look at, if you're planting trees, how much more pollutants you can capture by those tree planting efforts. And since I'm talking to some folks with an academic background, just to let you know too, that you can create new data and plug it into this spreadsheet and run other calculations. So we have a little step-by-step instruction manual on how you could take GIS data, how to classify it to put it in here. All right. So you can play around with here. I just was really ambitious and I planted 50% of all the plantable area for every watershed, and I get my new numbers. So not everyone loves spreadsheets. So we've also created a map. So in this case, what we have is the optimal places in Orange County where trees should be retained. And it's a little hard to see at this scale because you have a big county, so trying to look at it on the screen is a little tough. But the darker the green area, the more important it is to retain trees in those locations. And that is because those are the areas with the most absorptive soils. So those trees will do best at helping soak up water in those areas. And then the opposite, the converse, of course, is if you want to plant new trees in Orange County, where are the places that were the most important for soaking up water? And again, at this scale, it's hard to see, but you can take the data and zoom in and then clip out a particular neighborhood or part of the county. And this can be helpful if you are, say, working on a planting campaign for a particular community. You can use this data for that. And let me just note, this kind of work is not the typical work that you would see done. So for example, Orlando has done its own tree canopy map, but they wouldn't have necessarily done this level of analysis to figure out trees and stormwater values. All right, and then you can even look at the streets. So again, this is really hard to see, so we made a little zoom in on the right side. We've classified all the streets in Orange County by how well shaded they are. And again, this is a little sort of key of what we said, greater than 25% shade was good, but you can even change these values. So for example, in Miami Beach, they said we want 50% shaded is good. So you can play around with what these values are. But if you're working on, say, making a downtown more livable, or you want to create walking to school or other things, you can use this map to set strategies. Where should you focus tree planting efforts at the street scale? The next question, so I've gone through kind of the values and the data and how you can model and set goals for different watersheds in Orange County. And now I'm just going to talk about policies and practices. And probably the easiest way to explain this would be, if you told me that you were planting 100 trees, I would say, that's great. I'm so glad you're doing that. But I might also be concerned if Orange County had a policy in place that was causing 10 extra acres to be cleared for parking. So we're trying to look at the entire picture, not just tree care, planting, and management, but we're also asking, what are the policies that are maybe making it harder for trees to survive or causing you to pave too much of the county? So we have a little audit tool that asks the city or county, or so it's designed for cities and counties, do you allow too much impervious area? And can you manage and expand your urban forest? So then back to the exciting spreadsheet. But all that's required to do this spreadsheet is to see if the policy is in place, and then it automatically assigns you ranked points for that. So if it's in place, you click yes, and then it tells you whether it was essential, good, or would be nice. Right? So it gives you a ranking. So an example of something that would be nice is designating a tree as a historic tree, but it's not essential. All right. So you go through this and you click on the different things. And I'll tell you one funny thing. In one community we studied, and not Orange County, but another community I won't name, we asked them if they had a policy, if they were enforcing it, and they didn't know that it existed, so we knew they weren't enforcing it. So we gave them no points for that policy. So it's also important to find out how effective the policy is. For example, if you have a policy for tree removal permits and you grant removal permits 100% of the time and no qualified professional reviews the permit, then it's probably not an effective ordinance. Okay, so what are some kinds of things that we look at? So during construction, do you require sturdy protection? So codes often just ask for this sort of orange fabric. You've probably seen it around. it's very, very easy for heavy equipment to drive over that. And I see that falling down on a lot of construction sites. If you have something that's really important to protect, you might want to think about investing in some metal fencing. So for example, as you mentioned, I'm a professor, and when our university president had work done around his grounds of his president's house, you can be sure that all of the construction fencing was metal. Just want to make sure he protected the historic trees. We also want to consider tree protection fencing. How big is it? How wide of an area does it go out to? Sometimes the drip line is what people go to. That's actually considered a really good standard if they put the fence all the way out as far as the drip line. But it turns out your roots extend another half time farther than that. So if you really want to protect a tree, you need an even bigger fence. And then if you're working with construction workers who are multilingual, you might want to think about having your signage in different languages. Okay, and then also shrinking the development footprint. So does the community allow lot line to lot line clearing, meaning that before you've even got your site plan, before you've even asked for permission to develop the site, you've already cleared it. And so now we can't have a conversation about how many trees you might have left on the site. So we try to look for those kind of opportunities and discourage allowing this type of activity to go on. That is a picture from Orange County. And then this is always a controversial one, requiring at least 1,000 cubic feet of soil volume for any new tree plantings. That sounds like a high number, and it is, but that's actually what trees require to grow strong and healthy if they're a large canopy tree. Lots of cities have a standard where they have only 200 square feet. We call that a coffin for a tree. Winter Park has actually really strong standards for tree planting, for example. So there are some great examples. We're doing a good job. And Orange County has been experimenting with several sites where they're trying to increase the planting quality. But it's always a tension between the county and Florida DOT, right? Because if we want enough room to plant, then we might need to shrink some of those roads. So it's hard when we're already developed to put the right planting box in, but it's worth it. And in already developed environments, so this picture is actually from downtown Auburn, Auburn. I did not find a silva cell that I knew of in Orange County, but that's what this is. It's putting these structural supports underground so you don't see them. So you might just see a tree that looks like this on the left. And these structural supports help the roots go where you want them to go and not interfere with the sidewalk, and also helps a tree that's going to grow very tall have the structural support to grow tall in a tight space. So there's a lot of great reports out there on how to use these underground structures to help support your trees. Downtown Atlanta, for example, has put in some very tall trees in some tight spaces because they went ahead and invested in retrofitting the underground spaces with these cells. The other thing you can do also is have permeable pavers or permeable sidewalk. So instead of having this run off, all of the water, for example, in this picture, all of the pavement around it is permeable. So every raindrop that falls, instead of running into the storm drain, is actually going to nourish those tree roots. And then a lot of that will be evaporated back. And then this is a mall in Orange County, and it's in the middle of a busy day, but you just don't see a lot of that parking lot in use. A lot of our parking lots are designed for Black Friday, right? When everyone goes shopping, or used to. I don't know what will happen this year, but you have all this excessive parking, and you don't need to have that, right? So there are lots of different ways that you can redesign parking spaces, shrinking them, putting in trees, providing overflow parking that's actually reinforced grass instead of just having the entire area paved all of the time. And then complete green streets. All right, so having a policy that incorporates vegetation like this, where there's a notch cut in the side. This is a bioswale that can be treating the stormwater, and you can have multiple uses of the street. So Orange County, when I did this slide I can't remember how long ago this was, a year and a half ago at least, was developing a complete streets policy. And we suggested the county develop a complete green streets policy to make sure that they added bioswales, trees, and other measures. And so far they haven't adopted it. So if anyone wants to be an advocate, you can advocate first that they adopt the complete streets policy, and secondly, that they make sure that they incorporate vegetation. And I provided a link if you want to look up the status. And then encouraging more shade tree plantings on property. So I'm sorry, I wrote city or county. So this is actually a county park in Orange County, because we do have a lot of parkland that's available, but we want to make sure that we provide proper shade trees. In the South, we see a lot of crepe myrtles. I have nothing against them. I have 3 in my yard, but I also have lots of diversity of other types of trees. And then encouraging tree plantings on private property. I like this little kid in the Florida backyard. So establish neighborhood and community tree planting campaigns. So the most effective way to ensure that we have tree canopy long into the future in Orange County, in addition to changing policies, is to also encourage residents to plant trees and also encourage them to maintain them so that they don't come down in a storm. And I'm working right now on a campaign guide, so how to have a successful tree planting campaign. And there's a lot of fun ideas that I'm incorporating that I found throughout the South. One of my favorite, just to see if you're all awake, is some breweries give out beer if you plant a tree. And I figure a good craft beer costs around $6. Yet people will buy a $100 tree to get a $6 beer. So that's the psychology of Americans. It works. It's really effective. And the brewery, of course, usually figures you'll come in and buy a second beer while you're there. So everyone wins. But there's also other fun events like Jam and Jams. Not everyone thinks of trees first. A lot of us think first of pie. And so they have workshops where they give away fruit trees, but also teach you how to make pie with all the different fruits. So all the foodies to suddenly become tree planters. So there are many different ways to encourage and incentivize people to plant trees, because the best place for a tree to survive is actually this little kid's backyard. A street is a really rough place for a tree because they have underground utilities and overhead wires and all these other complications. So to the degree that people can plant in their backyards, that's the most successful strategy. And here's an example of how that might turn out. So for one of our communities in the study, we just analyzed how many parcels they had. So we came up with 47,500 parcels for single family homes. 31,000 of them could fit at least one tree. Now we weren't greedy. Some of them could fit 3 or 4 trees, but we just put one in each yard that could fit it. And we calculated that if everyone then planted that single tree who could fit one, they would capture an additional 62 million gallons of rainwater every year, or 1.5 million bathtubs. So that level of work can really pay off when we're thinking about reducing urban flooding. And then we recommend that the county update their canopy map every 4 to 5 years because we want to see how we're doing. We don't want to just have a snapshot in time, but to actually track changes in our forest cover, especially with all of the hurricanes that we've been having. There's probably more trees down than we realize. And then I would like to see Orange County develop an urban forest management plan. Now, despite the fact that it says urban, and some parts of the county are rural and some are urban, I still think that a forest management plan would allow the county to have measurable goals for how much canopy they want to have into the future, and then to make sure that all of these actions are ensconced in planning and zoning and public works and the Parks Department. And I like to point out that the Florida Forest Service offers grants to cover this cost. So we just finished a big project with Boynton Beach, Florida, and then we encouraged them to get into the management track. So now they have gotten funding for multiple years to do a tree inventory of their individual trees and to develop a forest management plan, all funded by your tax dollars. So suggest that you guys consider that. And then as your university, I'm not sure how much, whether you have a forest management plan yourselves, but if you don't, I highly recommend it. And then a response plan, too. Like, what do we do when trees come down suddenly in a storm or just from old age? Do we take the trees to the landfill? You may have some specimen trees that actually the wood would be quite valuable. And so some communities have actually set up a system where when they have a valuable tree come down, they actually are already linked into local carpenters who can take that wood and then dry it in a kiln and then make furniture or other materials out of it. Or even if you had students at the school who would like to have some of it, you can make benches. I mean, there are so many things you can do with that wood instead of just put it in a landfill. So having a plan in place to know what to do instead of reacting quickly is really important. And then also linking all of the urban communities with Orange County and the rural communities to using their trees for stormwater infrastructure. So we do run into the challenge because the state of Florida doesn't recognize a tree as a best management practice, but multiple cities and counties are starting to do that. So the Center for Watershed Protection, this might be also something fun to do with your students, has tools to calculate the volume benefits per tree. So you can go out and measure any tree on campus and then calculate its stormwater benefits individually, as well as other benefits for cleaning the air. And here's some examples of how cities have actually given credit. So Pine Lake, Georgia gives you 10 gallons of water credit per inch of diameter at breast height. And that's for trees under 12 inches of diameter at your chest height, or 20 gallons of credit if you preserve existing trees that are large. Washington, D.C. just has a real simple equation, 20 cubic feet of water credit, stormwater credit for each preserved tree and 10 cubic feet for each planted tree. So they're trying to encourage you to keep trees by giving you more credits for retaining those trees in place, because obviously a larger tree soaks up more water. But just showing these examples to say that it can be done. And one day Florida will have a state credit. And then Portland, of course, they always do everything great, but they have a simple credit that you can offset 10% of a site's impervious surface that you don't have to treat for stormwater management if you plant trees. All right, and so how did the county score? Now, I want to say before you get too carried away with these bar charts is that as a county, Orange County is going to lack some of the strategies that a city might normally have in place. But nevertheless, there are still things they could do better. So tree care and protection standards, they got up to about 50%. So these are all the different elements, plans and goals. They could do a lot more planning for their forest. Implementation capacity for one thing, whatever that was, they scored 100%. Emergency response, they don't have a lot of emergency plans in place in terms of the forest. And then monitoring progress. So every community, we don't give them a grade like F is a fail and A is perfect, but we want them to kind of see what those areas are where they might be doing well and areas where they can improve. So to wrap up, I'll just give you quickly the findings from our 12 trees and stormwater communities that we studied across the South. So not surprisingly, most cities don't use their urban forests to manage stormwater. I think in the US, the best place that's doing this is the Pacific Northwest. They are kind of the leaders in doing that. And as I just showed you, some places in the South as well. Most cities don't assess trees for risks before storms. So actually having someone who's what's called track certified to monitor those trees and make sure what condition they are before a storm. So that might be something, if you haven't done a track assessment for the college, I would highly recommend that, because that is part of asset management and reducing risk. Most cities don't have a map of their urban canopy. And I'm being specific here, saying that they need the actual locations of the trees, not random statistically generated data, but actual locations. Most cities' tree planting campaigns are limited to public property. Right. So in Jacksonville, where we've been working, that's their challenge. They actually have a huge fund, hundreds of thousands of dollars for tree planting, but they're only allowed to use it on public property and they're running out of room. So the key is to figure out how to use some of these funds to plant on private land as well. Most cities don't have canopy goals or budgeting tools. We actually made a tool for budgeting, so you could play with that. And then developments that have lot line to lot line clearing are really a problem. And then over paving. All right, solutions. Trees can be used as a BMP, like I said, but some state standards may need changing. Trees can be assessed for risk prior to storms. Houston actually did a really good job of that. Cities can set canopy goals and planting strategies. And Norfolk, Virginia, and a funny thing to tell you quickly, that was one of our study cities. And when we started, they actually had a goal that was higher than the amount of space that trees could be planted in. They would have had to raise buildings to do their goal. And that's because they didn't use any data when they set their goal. So that's why it's so important to have good data. And then a lot of cities are enlisting community groups as planting partners. So we're not saying that the county needs to do everything, but to help foster groups like master naturalists, master gardeners, scout groups, etc. Some cities help citizens track tree planting projects. So Jacksonville, for example, has a particularly great website where you can see where all the trees are being planted. You can actually dial a short phone number and get a tree in front of your house. So they have got a request line, a digital map. You can see whose neighborhood is getting more trees planted, little healthy competition there. And then some cities do prohibit lot line to lot line clearing and have minimum canopy standards established. And then some cities are using those structural tools, like I mentioned, in Auburn, Alabama, and Atlanta, Georgia. So if you're interested in learning more about the specific recommendations we made, you can get our case study specifically for Orange County, or if you're interested in sort of the big picture, you can also take a look at our study of the 12 communities. That's available on our website for free, and we continue to follow up on implementation. And let me also say that our center has been around for about 13 years, and I'm very, very patient. So some of the cities that I work with, say 3-4 years ago, are just now calling me to tell me we implemented our ordinance or we got a new planting budget. So counties and cities move very slowly. So eventually we'll find Orange County doing even more and more for their forests. But the first step is to have good data. So with that, I don't know if I've used up all my time, but I've left that is my last slide. You have survived, and there's a nice bird to look at to make you feel calm.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Firehawk. This was great. I think we do have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. If anyone wants to unmute themselves, or you can even put it in the chat, and I'm happy to read it aloud if we have any questions.
Carrie, I'd like to just, if that's okay, make a comment and question. Great presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And I was wondering, you mentioned something about we could get a hold of the GIS data, the land
Sure.
covered data. That would be, yeah. So is that on your website?
No, you would just tell me who would like it, and then I'll create a link so that you can download it.
Okay. Okay. I guess, Carrie, you have her email, and I can just email you. Okay. Thank you so much. That was great.
Absolutely. I can also send you the little calculator tool that I showed you so you can play around with it as well as the maps. Sure.
I can see these as being great projects for students. And I'm also vice president of a group called Friends of the Wekiva River. And so I was pretty interested. You had some Wekiva River data and little Wekiva data. So
yeah. And it's already sorted by watershed, so you could just clip out the Wekiva River and go to town with cool statistics. And I have found groups have actually successfully used this data to help them with fundraising. To be able to set goals and show clear delineations of where your canopy is and where you'd like to plant and why. Funders love data; they love to see reasons.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Perfect. And do we have any other questions? I think we have time for maybe one more. Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Professor Firehawk. Again, this was so informative. And I think since the time that the study was done, the Orange County has also now created and hired a chief resiliency officer. So I know he's getting up to speed on everything and moving so quickly on lots of things. So hopefully, I know this will be coming across his radar as well. And hopefully we'll get some movement in this area within Orange County.
That's great news. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you all for coming and attending our Tree Campus USA event. And if you have any questions or anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will put my email in the chat. And otherwise, everyone, please stay safe and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.